Okay, well, friends, it is, as Quakers say, near the appointed hour. So let's gather. A few more people are still gathering, so we'll just try to assemble folk. And I will try to stand over here so you don't stare into the sun. While we're waiting people to assemble, if folk are interested, there is a book about the graveyard. We're not going to visit all the graves in the graveyard this morning. We'll meet a lot more of them on Memorial Day. On Monday, we'll do a full tour. But this book is available if anyone's interested, $10 from the Cemetery Association. One of our fine friends from Yadkin County is writing out a check right now for 2 of them.
Hey, Max, give me 2 of those puppies.
Oh my gosh.
Somebody that's mentioned in there, Floyd Moore.
I think some Faganses are mentioned in there too, aren't they? The brochure that's going around was produced by our fine city's planning department. The mayor of which city is with us right now, Nancy Vaughn. So we're delighted to have Nancy, who's still campaigning. So, but there is an election coming up this summer.
Everybody got it.
Anybody else need any? But the planning department put together this brochure of the heritage community of New Garden Guilford College. And it's that organization that's sponsoring this tour this morning. The Guilford College and New Garden Community Alliance was organized many years ago to help preserve the heritage and character of this community, and have done a wonderful job of promoting all of the wonderful history that's here, some of which you're going to experience today. It's also supported by the North Carolina Friends Historical Society, which also has a mission to promote the history and legacy of Friends in North Carolina. In the brochure, you will see some mention of Woodyside, the Woodies, and the school that used to stand in Woodyside that we'll point to the site of. When we get to Woodyside, it's going to be one of those things that, well, there used to be. And if you're familiar with a stretch of West Friendly and the New Garden Guilford College community, and just looking at this brochure produced about 2 years ago, you'll notice that a lot of structures that used to be are no longer. So again, it's part of the work of the heritage community to help preserve that heritage and that history and call that attention to folk in the city about what has been here, what has been lost, but what still needs to be preserved. What we'll do this morning is briefly stroll through the graveyard to point out graves of some of those who preceded the Woodies in an emphasis on interracial work, on work against slavery, work in establishing the manumission societies, the Underground Railroad, education for blacks in this community long before it was even legal. And then we'll get to the Woodies and talk about their significance not only in this community but in the wider community around the country. They are responsible for about a half of the Quaker-founded colleges in the United States. Pretty significant, as well as 2 local institutions that they were very influential in establishing. So we'll then pause a bit about that and talk about that connection then to Woodyside before we hop in our cars and caravan. As I was telling our friends here, where's Woodyside? Well, it's off of Hibbler. Well, where's Hibbler? It says, if you cross over West Market, where Hedgecock used to be, pass by that, and if you remember the 2 houses that used to be there, just past there, you turn right onto Hibbler. And we'll point out the things that used to be in Woodyside before we then, at 11 o'clock, gather at Persimmon Grove, AME on Dolly Madison, for a conversation with Theresa Meacham. Logie Meacham's mother. Many of you remember Logie Meacham, the wonderful musician. Age 95, still sharp as a tack, grew up in that community and has stories to tell. So Gwen Gosney Erickson, the archivist at Guilford College, and I will be inviting her to share with us about the history of Woodyside, her experience growing up in Woodyside, her memories, their confrontations with the KKK, and all that kind of good stuff. So that'll be at 11 over at Persimmon Grove. So if you're ready for a jaunt through the graveyard and then on to the Woodyside in Persimmon Grove, will follow me?
Right. We'll try.
Okay.
We'll try to keep up.
Okay, can you hear me back there? Okay, I grew up in Indiana calling hogs and cows, so I can ratchet it up more if you can't hear back there. The first grave I want to point out is George Swain's, and we'll say a bit about that, but you've just passed some other significant ones that we won't have time to talk about. How many of you remember Boren Brick? You just passed by the Borens. Addison Boren, interestingly enough, at the beginning of the Civil War, walked to Indiana to evade the Confederate draft, then came back here, establishing, the terracotta industry with his children. Then eventually Boren Brick, so pretty significant. And you pass by the Ballingers. So you remember the Ballinger Academy that used to be over here. The Ballinger Farm is still along Ballinger. The Ballinger Ordinary Inn, where George Washington supped in the late 1700s. We don't know if he slept there, but we know he ate there. And one of the Ballingers, Henry Ballinger, was responsible with another member of the New Garden community for purchasing this land in 1757. Henry Ballinger and one of the Hunts bought 53 acres from Richard Williams, whose farm encompassed not only this, but most of what's now Guilford College. His farmhouse is about where Harris Teeter is now. And during the Revolutionary War battles of 1781, March 15, 1781, Richard Williams contracted smallpox while aiding a British officer who fell in his farmland and died of smallpox, and he's buried here as well. But there's that Ballinger connection. But George Swain was one of three Quakers famously here involved in the case of Benjamin Benson. Any of you know the case of Benjamin Benson? There's a Benjamin Benson district in East Greensboro between Bennett College and A&T. Benjamin Benson was a free black up in Delaware, kidnapped and sold into slavery to a businessman here in Greensboro by the name of John Thompson. As a free black, he knew his rights, knew that he could sue for his freedom in the courts, went to the courts here in Greensboro, and George Swain, Vestal Coffin, whom we'll visit soon, and Enoch Macy, three Quakers with ties to Nantucket and the migration of Quakers from Nantucket, which had developed a strong anti-slavery sentiment, learned about the case and went to bat for Benjamin Benson. And because they were known entities in the formation of the Manumission Society and petitioning the legislature to end slavery and their involvement in anti-slavery activities, John Thompson got spooked, sold Benjamin Benson to another enslaver in Georgia, and Benson wound up in Georgia. Swain, Coffin, and Macy continued to advocate for him, and eventually Benson was extradited back to Guilford County, where in 1820 he gained his freedom through the court system, one of the first African Americans to do so in American history. Swain then went on to become the president of the Colonization Society in Guilford County. It was illegal to free your enslaved persons in North Carolina, so Quakers had to figure out, after they went anti-slavery in 1778, what to do with those they had enslaved and what to do to figure out how to address the problem of slavery when you couldn't legally free slaves. So one of the responses, in addition to the fact that Quakers who remained Quakers and knew they couldn't remain involved in slavery, handed title to their enslaved persons over to the yearly meeting, the Organization of Friends, to hold them as Quaker free Negroes. They had their own agency, they were independent, they were free, but if they were kidnapped, they could say, no, I'm owned. Owned by the Organization of Quakers. Quakers were the largest slave owners in North Carolina. They held title to about 1,000 persons for the purpose of their being free. Legislatures can figure that out, and so that wasn't an option for long. But one of the options was to find those who wanted to return to Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, or to Haiti, Dominican Republic, and the Caribbean. And George Swain headed up that organization until 1825, when he became convinced that wasn't working. Unscrupulous sea captains would sell their cargo into slavery, or the situation back in Africa and the Caribbean wasn't good. So Swain resigned that position, but remained here in the community, probably working behind the scenes with the Underground Railroad, and remained here until his death in the 1850s as the medical doctor in the community. One of the few Quakers to remain. We went from 20,000 Quakers around 1800 in the South to fewer than 2,000 Quakers by the end of the Civil War, because most packed up and went to free states, as we'll see with the coffins. Any questions about any of that before we head to Vestal and Alethea Coffin themselves? Yeah.
When exactly did the manumissions become legal in North Carolina?
Civil War. Yeah.
Not until then.
It was the Civil War, yeah.
Okay.
The Manumission Society, Vestal Coffin, Osborne's, down at Center Friends meeting, began the first Manumission Society in 1814, 1815. So they worked towards convincing people to free their enslaved persons, but it didn't happen until the Civil War. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, head here. Those of you remember Randall Jarrell, say hey to Randall Jarrell here on the left. And 2 Union soldiers who are buried here somewhere in unmarked graves who died during the Civil War. Okay, if you want to come around this way. You want to come around this way, we'll be talking about Vestal and Alethea Coffin.
Is that 1732?
1792.
92.
Yeah. Okay. I mentioned Vestal Coffin back with George Swain. He was one of the 3 New Garden Quakers who went to bat for Benjamin Benson, working to get his freedom through the court system. Vestal Coffin was an ardent abolitionist. Now, Quakers were divided into 2 camps after they went anti-slavery in 1778. They were the abolitionists, the minority of Quakers who recognized the institution of slavery as wrong, as sinful, and needed to be abolished right now. The majority of Quakers were gradualists. Slavery's wrong, but we shouldn't meddle with God's purposes, and it'll wither away gradually. We shouldn't be involved, especially with those other anti-slavery folk who might be non-Quakers. You know, those Free Methodists and Wesleyans and Congregationalists, and would be mixing and mingling with the world's people. And that was a testimony Friends had back then. So it was only a minority of Friends who were the activists like Vestal Coffin, Enoch Macy, George Swain, Levi Coffin, and others. But Vestal was a known entity. Helped start the first Manumission Society. He'd gone to bat for Benjamin Benson. And in 1819, another free black by the name of John Demery. There's a John Demery Road in the Benjamin Benson district of East Greensboro. John Demery was a free black who had lived with his family in South Carolina, then moved into southern North Carolina, and eventually recognizing that he was in danger, even as a free black, to being kidnapped, moved into the New Garden Quaker community, as many free blacks did, for that extra layer of protection in an anti-slavery Quaker community. Many of them lived along Horsepen Creek. If you know the story of the Currys, Lavina and Arch Curry had a 12-acre farm along Horsepen Creek. Vina Curry worked for the boarding school. And there's a new marker, historical marker along Friendly, dedicated to her. As she was washing away in the old boarding school, she got 15 fugitives from slavery out of here to freedom in the North by handing off her late husband Arch's free papers to them. And they would take them up to Indiana saying, "No, that's who I am." And a Quaker would then bring the papers back. She's washing away on her scrub board, handing the papers off to another person. She got 15 people out of here. So it was an interracial work. That has to be emphasized. This wasn't a Quaker organization. The Underground Railroad activity was a massive interracial civil disobedience movement centered here in Greensboro that is remarkable. But anyway, 1819, John Demery moves with his family, his wife Sarah and 4 children, into the New Garden community. And his former owner dies, and his sons decide, we're going to get our inheritance back. And they come riding into the New Garden community one winter night in 1819, find out where John Demery lives, ride up to his cabin door and yell out, "We've been hunting, we've gotten lost, we need assistance." When John Demery steps out of his cabin door, they jump him, tie him up with ropes. They're going to haul him off. His wife comes running out to see what the commotion is. They knock her unconscious. The daughter comes running out to see what's happening, and before they can knock her out, John Demery says, "Run, get Vestal Coffin." Now, the cabin of the Demerys must have been very close to what is now the Target Shopping Center, Kathleen Clay Edwards Library, Price Park, Jefferson Elementary, because that's where the Coffin Farm was, a 170-acre farm that is up there along New Garden Road. She runs through the night, finds that Vestal Coffin just stepped outside of their cabin to get a load of firewood. Here's what's happening. He drops the firewood, doesn't even grab a winter coat, but grabs a neighbor, and they run back in time to intercept the kidnappers. And while Vestal Coffin is letting them know they're in trouble, because he's done this before, they can go to prison for this because they are kidnapping a free black, and he knows the legalities. They don't know quite how to respond. So while they're trying to figure out their next moves, the neighbor unties Demery's ropes, and he springs into the woods and free. The kidnappers then don't know what to do, so they hop on their horses and hightail it out of there. Later on that night, John Demery comes back to the Coffin cabin, and they map out his route to Indiana, because they'll be back and he's got to get out of here. And the route was essentially the route that Quakers were taking as they were leaving the South. Essentially up 52, over the Blue Ridge, through southern Virginia to Charleston, and then by steamer or foot along the Kanawha to the Ohio, along the Ohio to Cincinnati, and then up, there's still a road north of Cincinnati called the Quaker Trace, and you head up to Richmond, a Quaker town established in 1806 by 3 Quakers from Randolph County and the Free State, and the home of Liz Nicholson, who grew up in Richmond. 6 weeks later by foot, John Demery arrives in Richmond and freedom, works for 2 years to earn enough money to send for Sarah and the children, and they eventually join. Now that was the end of the story as far as I knew it until last month. I was invited to speak up at the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum. Adrienne Israel was supposed to go, but she got sick. But they had asked us to talk about Levi and Catherine Coffin's origins here in the New Garden community. Because if you grow up in Indiana, you hear the story about Levi and Catherine Coffin, and you think they're just products of Indiana. Well, no. They grew up here, were deeply influenced by the anti-slavery abolitionist movement here, and then left for Indiana in 1826 when Levi was 28 years old. So before I gave the talk about the origins of the Coffins here, I was taking a tour of the museum that Liz's grandfather helped create. And there on the wall was a big map of the Underground Railroad routes into the north. Interestingly enough, at the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum, they don't have the route from North Carolina to Indiana. I don't know why, but we did point that out. And they said, this will be corrected, because several thousand went on that route. But anyway, along with the roots of the Underground Railroad, were the free black communities that were established in Indiana by those fugitives who settled in Indiana and didn't go on to Canada. And there, just a few miles outside of Old Newport, now Fountain City, where the Coffins had their home, their Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad, through which 2,000 to 3,000 fugitives went to their freedom, was the free black community of Cabin Creek, established 1825 by John and Sarah Demery. So that's what happened to them. They not only found their freedom in Richmond, they went on then to establish a free black community just north of Richmond, just a few miles from the Coffins. So another link between here. So they got to add that route, I think, on their maps. But anyway, Vestal Coffin is known as the first conductor on the Underground Railroad here in Guilford County, perhaps in North Carolina. John Demery, the first passenger on the Underground Railroad here. So very significant nationally. Well, he continues his work until he dies on his birthday at the age of 34, October 10th, 1826, the same year that most of the Quakers here were heading to Indiana. Levi and Catherine Coffin packed up and left in 1826, along with a lot of people here. His wife, Alethea, kept up the work while trying to maintain a hard-scrabble farm of 170 acres and 4 small children. Didn't have enough money to pack up and go to Indiana. But when she finally got enough money, she put the possessions on a wagon, headed for Indiana, and then got out and walked the 450 miles because it was too bumpy. The roads weren't very good. And got up there, couldn't stand it. She was away from her husband. They hadn't developed sugar cream pie up there. And she came back in 1833 and remained in the community until the New Garden Boarding School was founded in 1837, when she became the matron of the women's side. And so for about 20 years, along with Vina Curry, she worked at the boarding school and probably was behind the scenes with Vina, helping in getting those folk out of here. Finally, when her children were grown and they'd gone to Indiana, she packed up and finally went to Indiana, where she became the matron of the women's side of Earlham College, where she ran that place like a Marine Corps sergeant, because she knew where all those kids' parents were from. She knew them all from North Carolina. Said, if you misbehave, I know all of your aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, and kept them on the straight and narrow. Continued to live up there until her death in 1891. So 65 years a widow. By her request, she was returned here to be beside her husband. And while his epitaph kind of extols how everyone's missing him and mourning him and all that kind of good stuff, for the longest time, all I could see on her epitaph was died in Indiana. But underneath it, if you pull the grass away, buried in her wedding dress. She held on to that wedding dress through multiple trips to Indiana and still fit in it when she died. But if you're walking back and forth to Indiana, you'd probably fit in your wedding dress too. But anyway, amazing folk, amazing folk.
Max, what does it mean to be matron of women's side?
She was kind of the dean of women. So she made sure that they were tucked in, made sure that they were there at curfew, and weren't going out to meet the boys in the graveyard and all of that.
You mentioned to authorities looking for slaves about earthen vessels.
That was Levi. His
Oh,
cousin.
Levi, okay.
Yeah.
You talk about that as you...
Yeah, there's, again, if you're on the Underground Railroad, it's illegal for one thing. There are slave chasers that can chase you all the way up to Indiana because of the Fugitive Slave Act. So it's a dangerous proposition. And Quakers had a problem because, number one, they were anti-slavery, so they couldn't betray the passengers, those they were trying to protect. But they also couldn't use violence. That would violate the peace testimony. So they couldn't pull a pistol out of their pocket, like, I'm not going to mention a local politician running for Senate who likes to have a pistol stuck in his pocket. But anyway, they couldn't, shoot, the folk pursuing their enslaved persons, and they couldn't lie about it. because all those testimonies of honesty, integrity, equality, peace are equal in importance. So they came up with all kinds of ruses. One of my favorite was when Levi Coffin was up in Indiana. He had a specially built wagon like the one down at Mendenhall Home Place, a false bottom wagon used to transport passengers in a secret compartment underneath the cargo bay, so no one suspected that what you were really doing. And on this day, providentially and maybe intentionally, Levi Coffin had a cargo of clay pots. It was transporting up north from Fountain City, and also had 2 passengers in that false compartment. Slave chaser stopped him, didn't have the proper papers to search, but figured a Quaker had to answer honestly a direct question. So he said, "What are you really carrying in the bottom of that wagon, Coffin? I know what you're up to." Coffin looks back at his clay pots and says, "Earthen vessels. I'm just carrying earthen vessels," which clay pots are, but so are we, made of the dust and clay of the earth. There are all kinds of stories like that. My great-great-grandparents, had a ruse like that, not about earthen vessels, but about what Grandma was really doing upstairs with the kids, tucking them in bed when they had fugitives up there. And the slave chasers came, knocked on the door, and there was a secret Underground Railroad knock. Edith Mackey, buried over there in that corner, learned it from her grandparents, who were conductors in the Underground Railroad in Indiana. Edith Mackey just died 12 years ago at the age of like 104. Remember these stories that she heard from her grandmother. The Underground Railroad knock was 3 loud bangs, a pause, then 2 loud bangs, and you knew it was fugitives and not slave chasers. Well, Grandpa Johnson hears the knock on the door. It's not the Underground Railroad knock. Opens it, and there's a slave chaser and the manager. They got papers, and they can search the house. But again, he can't shoo them away. He can't pull the 30-06 off the rack and blow them away. He can't lie about it. He says, "Well, if you'll wait here in the parlor where my wife puts the children to bed upstairs, you can search the house. But right now my wife's putting the children to bed, so stay here in the parlor." Grandma hears it, knows what's up, gets the fugitives who are upstairs. It's just after supper time, gives them instructions on how to get to the next station, which is our Uncle Jimmy Stanley's house. They slip out through the 2nd floor window onto the back porch roof, shimmy down the post, through the barnyard, through the pasture field to the woods in safety, and Grandma then tucks the children in bed. Yells down, "Well, dear, the children are in bed now. They may send our guests up." They didn't find anything. So there are all kinds of things you had to do to keep all those balls in the air. Now, I heard that story directly from my great-aunt Otto, who heard it directly from her grandparents. So a lot of this comes down orally. You didn't write this stuff down because it's all illegal. So much of this comes down orally, so who knows how it's been embossed, how much it's apocryphal, but it's all rooted in some reality. Other questions before we head on? Yeah.
Okay, you probably covered this, and I apologize, but what's the relationship of Vestal to Levi?
First cousins.
First cousins.
First cousins, yeah. Alrighty, this way. We're going to get to the Woodies eventually, but if you come for the Memorial Day tour at 10 o'clock on Monday, you'll hear the full story here. But I just wanted to point out to you football fans that Georgiana Staley Coble is the sister of the founder of the Chicago Bears. So you'll get that story on Monday. Yeah.
I see you recovered from your leg surgery.
Yeah.
Still moving.
And as soon as that one got healthy, I put a nail through this one.
Oh.
They're both okay now, thank
Okay,
goodness.
yeah, they balance each other.
Okay, again, you'll hear a more complete story on Monday about the Binbos. But have any of you ever heard of DeWitt Binbo? DeWitt Binbo was a wealthy business person here in Greensboro around the Civil War era. He moved to Greensboro because he was a conscious objector, and he wasn't overly welcome down in Fayetteville, where he was a dentist. Moved here and built the first luxury hotel in Greensboro, the Binbo House, which stood where Woolworth's is now. So there's that connection. And it was in the Binbo House that Mary Woody, whom we'll finally get to soon, helped start the North Carolina branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and went on to be the first president of WCTU. DeWitt Binbo, although probably forgotten by most folk in Greensboro now, brought a black college to Greensboro, now A&T. He's responsible for A&M, now A&T coming here. He resurrected Greensboro College after it burned down, got it going. He was on the committee that established Guilford College out of New Garden Boarding School, and he was on the committee working with Mary Woody, John Woody, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, and Charles McIver to get the Industrial and Normal College for Women established in the 1890s, today's UNCG. DeWitt Binbo, he's not buried here, but other Binbos are, was responsible for every college and university in Greensboro. So, amazing guy. Anyway.
Who were his parents?
Binbos.
Well, okay.
Uh,
think they're,
he grew up out there.
they're Oak Ridge Binbos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oak Ridge Binbos.
So it's not
Yeah.
the same
He was an
bimbos
Oak
as
Ridge
furniture?
Binbo.
I can't remember if it's Earl or...
Yeah, Bob Binbo, all those Binbos. So again, trying to make the connections with the historical work of the Quaker community with the African American community. And here's one of the most important of them. In 1816, a proper brick schoolhouse was built for the New Garden Quaker community. Every little Quaker congregation had to have a grammar school because Quakers back then didn't have an ordained clergy, didn't have pastoral ministers. Everyone had to know how to read the Bible, read the histories. There was no public school system, and Quakers were not welcome in the established church's schools because they were nonconformists. So every little Quaker meeting had a little grammar school. And this is where the first proper brick schoolhouse was built in 1816 near the old yearly meeting house. 1821, Levi Coffin goes to local enslavers and says, we're going to open up that little school on first day afternoons, Sunday afternoons, as a Sabbath school to teach people how to read the Bible. Would you allow your enslaved persons to come? We're going to teach enslaved persons how to read the Bible. Now, that'll be very beneficial. The Bible teaches humility, peace, harmony, nonviolence. In the culture of the South, the Quakers weren't using it this way, but preachers used the Bible to justify slavery. So the idea of teaching their enslaved persons how to read the Bible wasn't totally off the rails for some of the more progressive ones like David and Rachel Caldwell. So they said, oh, sure, fine. It was their backdoor way of teaching literacy. It was against the law to teach enslaved persons how to read because you didn't want them reading the abolitionist press, reading about Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, the Liberator. And it was so effective in teaching literacy that within months, other enslavers shut that school down. And if you look at the list of teachers Most of them wound up in Indiana. Jeremiah Hubbard, Elijah Coffin became clerk of Indiana Yearly Meeting. Levi Coffin, Vestal Coffin, as we know, died 1826. Horace Cannon, who was another medical doctor here, his farm is where Lowe's Foods is on New Garden. His son is quite famous. You'll see historical markers a couple places in Greensboro for him. Horace Cannon's son was Joseph Gurney Cannon. There's an historical marker down at Battleground in New Garden for him. There's a marker at Guilford for him. He graduated from the first class of Earlham College, where Mary Woody attended in the 1800s, and went on to get a law degree and practice law in eastern Illinois, where he was a representative of his congressional district for 46 years. And from 1903 to 1911 was Speaker of the House of Representatives, and was on the cover of the First Time magazine. Old Cannon Office Building in D.C. is named after Horace Cannon's son. So not insignificant people taught here, but they had to get the heck out of here because of their illegal activity. So now we're going to go to the Woodies. Any questions here?
How long was this school?
Months.
Okay.
Just months.
Okay.
And again, it was so effective, as Levi Coffin writes in his reminiscences, other slave owners said this was making their enslaved persons restless. And so they shut it down.
So these
Yeah.
are here. These are the cornerstones for how big the school was, right here and over here.
No, the school was pretty small. Those are probably markers for plots or
Okay.
something. But no, I don't think the school was that big.
Oh, really? Okay.
But
That was big.
you may be right. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've never really actually noticed them before.
Yeah, 'cause there's
But in
two-
pictures, it looks a lot smaller than
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Like a little one-room school. I have to check into that. I have to check into that.
Let me know.
That would be interesting. Okay, we have finally arrived at the Woodies, and delighted that Waldo Woody's daughter, the granddaughter of John and Mary Woody, is with us. Right over here in the shade. If any of you know Seth and Mary Edith Henshaw, you can't miss the family resemblance. Pick her out of a crowd. But anyway, I hope you'll kick in with some of your memories. Okay, John and Mary Woody, in the 1880s, when they were on staff of New Garden Boarding School, having been recruited by Francis King, the head of the Baltimore Association to advise and assist Friends of the Southern States after the Civil War, was working to transition the boarding school into a college, knowing that John and Mary had established a bunch of colleges, invited them to come and help in that transition. So while they were here, they purchased land south of the railroad tracks that eventually became known as Woodyside. We'll get to that history in a moment, but that's the connection. But backing up, John Woody grew up over in Alamance County around the spring meeting. Mary's family went even further back than that. She is descended from one of the people who established North Carolina Yearly Meeting in 1698. Francis Toms, who was in the Assembly of North Carolina at a time when it was a Quaker colony, with a Quaker governor and a majority Quaker assembly, and the first public school was Quaker, and the first organized European religion was Quaker, 1698. It was Francis Toms who hosted George Fox in 1672, when one of the founders of Quakerism visited North Carolina for the first time. So we're kind of talking Quaker royalty here. She's descended from that. They eventually, like many Quakers in Indiana and North Carolina, moved to Indiana, and she grew up around Thorntown in Boone County, just north of Indianapolis. Strong Quaker community there on Sugar Plain. She attended the Bloomingdale Academy, where Edith Mackey's family attended. So all these connections. She went to Earlham College and eventually taught at the Sugar Plain Quaker Academy in the 1860s. John Woody, raised here, went to New Garden Boarding School, graduated from there about 1849, and at the beginning of the Civil War, walked to Indiana to evade the Confederate draft. A lot of folk here, like Addison Boren, walked to Indiana to evade the Confederate draft. The kids in the boarding school just went to the woods and hid out, while the women on staff hung baskets of food back there in the woods so they had something to eat while they were evading the draft. Well, John, with his reputation for education, is hired to teach in the Sugar Plain Academy, and they meet. Now, get married and continue not only their teaching, but their education. They get a law degree from the University of Michigan. They take additional study in some of the colleges around there, but with their background, they are then invited to start a little Quaker college in Salem, Iowa, that was named Whittier, after John Greenleaf Whittier, the great Quaker poet and abolitionist. That school folded within a couple of years, but they were invited down to Oskaloosa then to start William Penn College, which still is in existence. From there, they came back here to help transition New Garden into Guilford College, during which time John, who's teaching surveying, because his father was a surveyor and he had learned surveying, he and his students lay out what is now Guilford College Road to connect the boarding school with the train station. That road was laid out by John Woody. There's a picture on campus of him as a surveyor doing that. They also become aware of the devastation of the economy here after the Civil War. So John Woody and another faculty member of Guilford, Franklin Davis, start a cotton mill down on the Deep River, the High Falls Manufacturing Company. He was president of that for 25 years to provide income not only for workers, but to provide income for their Quaker work. Meanwhile, Mary is the first resident pastoral minister of New Garden Meeting and teaches elocution and Bible at the boarding school and the college, and forms the first women's Christian temperance union in the state, and becomes president, and becomes the vice president of the national WCTU under Francis Willard. Now, the WCTU wasn't just about lips that touch liquor will never touch mine. It was a feminist organization empowering women, not only because they had leadership and authority in the WCTU, but they were addressing the social ills that alcohol presented in families devastated by alcohol. So it was an early feminist movement, and Mary Mendenhall Hobbs is very active in it for those very reasons. And she works with Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, DeWitt Benbow, and others to start what's now UNCG. And travels all over North Carolina establishing Friends meetings, and attends the first conference of Quakers in Richmond, Indiana, 1887, that established what's now Friends United Meeting. Pretty significant woman. John Woody, again, after they leave here, he and Mary establish Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, because one of the students they tutored at William Penn College in Oskaloosa had not been accepted to William Penn because he wasn't that good a student, but John and Mary tutored him in their home in Oskaloosa. He went on to become one of the wealthiest people in America and bought the defunct Garfield University in Wichita and said, if you'll come out here, we'll turn it into a Quaker college if you'll be the first president. So they go out to Wichita and start Friends University. After that, they're invited out to Southern California to start Whittier College. alma mater of Richard Nixon. We don't mention that very often. So again, they establish all these Quaker colleges, but in their retirement come back here to New Garden. And in retirement, they buy a tract of land from the meeting. Remember, there are 53 acres the meeting bought, and half of it is Harris Teeter and Quaker Village now. Another bunch of it's on the college campus, a little triangle, but there's still this. And they laid out a little street. Anybody know Francis King Street? They laid out Francis King Street, named after the guy from Baltimore who essentially saved Southern Quakerism after the Civil War. King Hall on campus is named after him. Guilford was going to be King College, but he refused, saying, no, in Quaker humility, name it after your county. So that's why it's Guilford College. And with Franklin Davis, built 2 homes. Some of you remember those homes. They're kind of Victorian, large Victorian homes that, when I first came in 1990 to teach at Guilford, had become kind of run-down rental properties that Guilford College students lived in as party houses. The WCTU ghost of Mary Woody probably haunted them constantly. But those houses gave way to Harris Teeter. But significant connection here to those. Now, their son Waldo, your father, I understand, was a well-known pastor. He pastored what, Goldsboro?
I can't recall. He was
High Point?
more a tenor at,
Yeah.
No Hill,
Yeah.
several places.
I was doing some research on my great aunt Annis. 2 cousins of mine and I are writing a book about her missionary work in Palestine and Africa in the early 1900s. And in reading the material that we've accumulated about her life, there was a letter from Waldo Henshaw, who was on the committee of 5 years meeting, helped established by Mary Woody, recommending her to the mission committee of 5 years meeting for service in Palestine. And it was your father endorsed her to do that work. Grandfather.
Not that old.
Okay. Not that old. Grandfather, but your grandfather endorsed her for her missionary work in 1935. So again, the Quakers took their hats off. I was different. It was Waldo who, inheriting the land that the Woodys had purchased to make available for blacks to purchase when whites in the 1880s, 1890s weren't selling land to blacks, and laid out plots that blacks bought. Waldo donated one of those plots when he inherited that land for the building of a school. It's the school that's in your brochure. There had been a Rosenwald school. If you know the history of the Rosenwald schools in the South, Julius Rosenwald, the Jewish philanthropist, president of Sears, along with Booker T. Washington, saw to it that hundreds, if not thousands, of schools were built for blacks in the South. And there was a Rosenwald school up in the Persimmon Grove community along 421 West Market. The only thing remaining there now is that cemetery where the overpass goes right at the end of Stagecoach, near the Procter & Gamble factory. And there used to be a little church there. We'll hear about that history when we get to the current church. But next to that church and cemetery was built a Rosenwald school. When it burned down in the early 1900s, Waldo Woody donated a plot in Woodyside to build a new school. And if you look at the school building in your brochure, it's not a Rosenwald school, but it's patterned after. You'll recognize the windows, you'll recognize that architectural pattern. It was built on the model of those Rosenwald schools. So Waldo was the person who did that, and then it became known as Woodyside after his contribution of that plot. So that's the history there. You want to add anything else about the Woody heritage?
No, there's one point of interest is that there's a little girl buried here, Mary Woody Lindley, and she's the nephew of Waldo Woody. Alice and Alva Lindley had a little girl who died at age probably from the effects of hydrocephalus, and they decided since their history was originally here, they would come and bring their little girl here.
Okay.
So there's a Mary Woody Lindley buried right around it here somewhere.
So there, again, a lot of really interesting folks buried around here. You'll hear more story of on Monday, including the story of Pete and Lucretia Moore over there, who were largely responsible for integrating Guilford College. In 1953, Pete Moore wrote a letter to the Board of Trustees saying, it's high time we integrate. This is even before Brown versus Board of Education. At the time, we didn't have as progressive a mayor as we do now. Robert Frazier was the mayor of Greensboro, the chair of the Board of Trustees at Guilford, the chair of the Board of Trustees at A&T, separate but equal, and a slum landlord. He was not about to integrate Guilford College. So he put the clamps on that, but Pete kept working away, and finally in 1962 came up with, it was Clyde Milner and others, the ruse of, if we're ever going to get this world gathering of Quakers here at Guilford in 1967, this every 15 years gathering of worldwide Quakers, they're not going to come to a segregated campus in the segregated South, so we got to figure out a way to get past Bob Frazier and that conservative white Board of Trustees. How about if we bring 2 black Quakers from Kenya? The children of our missionary activity. That's, no one can oppose that. And Rudy was here. Yeah, you can name them. Who were they?
You brought Aquila and Rakama, Washington.
Yeah. Came in 1962. The sky didn't cave in. And that fall then, James McCorkle comes as the first African-American student at Guilford College. So Pete and Lucretia. Yeah.
As I was just telling Sarah Joe before that I remember when I was just a little girl growing up in Snow Camp, my grandparents lived there, had a farm there, and on Sunday afternoons, we used to travel and visit people on Sunday afternoon. No phone call, we just went to see people. And that afternoon, as we were visiting my grandparents, who were members of Cane Creek Friends Meeting, dating all the way back to its founding in 1751, they were visited with with Waldo and Ludy, I believe was her name, Woody. Now, I don't know where you might have been at that point. It would have been before 1953. It would have been before 1953 because they moved to Greensboro. My grandparents.
1953 was about when we moved here to Guilford College.
Well, I could tell as just a little girl that they were important people.
Yeah, if you talk to anyone here who remembers Waldo Woody, they have wonderful, fond memories of him as a pastor and a leader in Society of Friends. Now, before we pack up and head to Woodyside, you were also standing inside the site of the old yearly meeting house. And a couple things about it. You'll hear a lot more about this on Monday, but this is where the first yearly meeting house and meeting for New Garden was built. It became the yearly meeting house when the center of Quakerism moved from Perquimans and Pasquotank counties in the early 1790s out here, because this had become the largest community of friends. The Quakers out there, that's plantation territory. Quakers there were enslavers. And when Quakers went anti-slavery in 1778, most of those Quakers had to get out. They went from 12 meetings to 1, as most of those Quakers headed north. Yeah.
This is also the place somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where there was a meeting house during the Revolutionary War, and they took all kinds of soldiers in to heal them, whatever their
This is the place.
Right here.
Yeah, this was used as a field hospital for the Battle of New Garden. And there were hundreds who were wounded in those battles of March 15, 1781. And the old meeting house was fairly small at the time. It was replaced by the one you're familiar with, the big 2-story, 1,000 or 2,000 meeting house that was here from 1791 till 1875. But that old meeting house was packed so full of the wounded that they had to lay hundreds out on pallets throughout the graveyard. And that's why the big oak tree over there that sheltered some of them became known as the Revolutionary Oak, because it was here during those battles. And there's a whole story you'll hear on Monday about that and civil rights in 1955. But there's a mass grave over there we'll pass by on our way back to the parking lot, where 150 of those soldiers who died are buried, both American and British sympathizers buried together in that mass grave. So yeah, this is the very spot.
Yeah, I was here at New Garden Friends when Eleanor Roosevelt came to talk,
Yeah.
and the bomb went off.
So you heard the dynamite. Did you hear the dynamite?
Wait, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Because
Yeah.
we were just right. We were at the old New Garden, which
Yeah.
is administrative building.
Oh,
now.
cool. Now you were here too, weren't you? Yeah.
Tell us about the dynamite.
Okay, tell us about the dynamite, David. And
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was speaking here, and as you know, for someone like that to come into this area and speak, because she was very
1955.
progressive, 55. And of course, there were some irate people with about 50-some Quakers and others who had signed a letter to the editor supporting school integration. So there was a lot of fireworks and other things going on at that time. But someone just blew the H out of the tree. But Quakers are very enterprising. They sold a lot of the pieces of that tree to make money to help pay for part of this meeting house over here, if my memory serves me correct. Very creative.
yeah.
We have a table at New Garden
Yeah.
Meeting built from wood from that
Yeah.
tree.
There's furniture and gavels and picture frames and collection plates made out of that tree all over this community. And just a couple years ago, Jim Hood, a wonderful woodworker and just recently interim president of Guilford College, turned some of the remaining wood from that tree into the mantelpiece in the coffee shop at Guilford. So when you go in there and touch that mantelpiece, beautiful mantelpiece that he crafted, that's out of a stack of lumber left from that 1959 tree. It was blown up in 1955, but it was so massive that it didn't come down immediately. It came down in a storm 4 years later. Turned it into furniture and stuff, but a lot of it was milled by Orville Dillon, who was a woodworker and pastor down at Center Friends Meeting, and he gave a lot of the excess to a friend of his, and there's a whole history here I won't go into, Calvin Henshaw, a politician from Alamance County, who we won't talk a lot about. And that remained in his old hen house until he gave his farm to Guilford College. And some of the administrators at Guilford and I went down there to survey the 92-acre farm. And he said, oh, you might be interested in the old hen house. I've got something out there you might be interested in. There's this stack of wood from that tree that came down in 1959. And so all of that came to Guilford College. And it's still out there in the barn. There's still pieces that can be used. But anyway, go to the coffee shop sometime and touch that mantelpiece. That tree was born in 1492. When the tree came down, they counted the rings, 1492. Now, the story is that, again, Eleanor Roosevelt was speaking to an integrated audience, blacks and whites sitting together, which was described by the local folk as a promiscuous mingling of the races. Not overly popular with some of the folk, and while she's speaking, out in the graveyard, according to a person who lives over at Friends' homes now, and I won't mention her name because she says, don't mention my name, but I know who the boys were, and she named them. There were 3 boys, members of New Garden Meeting, who put dynamite at the base of that tree and blew it up. She said they were just bad boys. But I won't mention their names or hers. But most of you know who she is.
Write it down. That's history.
Yeah, deep throat, right. Sometime when the records are unsealed 50 years from now. It'll be revealed. But yeah, it was a major event. Now, during that activity, again, connecting all this with Quaker work and interracial issues, Quakers were working, they hadn't succeeded in integrating Guilford, so they set to work integrating the public schools. And that letter, signed by your parents and the Newlands and the Mackeys and all Moores and all kinds of folk, wasn't popular with the local folk. And some of them lost their jobs, lost their businesses. But the Quakers kept working at it. And they finally, through the work of the American Friends Service, recruited a young girl at Dudley High School, Josephine Boyd, to integrate Greensboro Senior High School, now Grimsley. 1957, as the lone black student, she goes off and integrates what's now Grimsley High School. So a long history here that is represented also in Woodyside, and especially is represented by their heroic work in so many ways.
And the street that runs in front of Grimsley, which used to be Westover, is now named for...
Yeah, Aycock. Yeah, Aycock's been changed to Josephine Boyd Bradley. So, quite a history. Okay, any questions, other additions, corrections? Yeah.
Next, was the two-story meeting house also here?
Yeah. Again, on Monday, you'll hear the full story of when they tore that smaller meeting house down to build a larger one to accommodate the growing community and the yearly meeting. They examined the boards that were incorporated into the ceiling because those were among the pallets that the soldiers were laid out on. And rumor has it that the dark splotches on those boards were the blood of those soldiers that bled out on those pallets that had already been milled in preparation for building the new meeting house in 1781. When they examined them to see if it was true, they found it was red carpenter's chalk, but it had served a purpose for the youth of the meeting for a long, long time that I'll tell you about on Monday. Anyway, but that was then torn down in 1875. And again, for those of you at Guilford, you know that replacing that meeting house was a brick meeting house over on campus. A large brick yearly meeting house built in the traditional style, the men's side, women's side, large brick structure that as the college was as the school was translating into a college with the Woodies involved, the yearly meeting gave that meeting house to the boarding school, which had become known as the Friends School of the Carolinas. And they moved to High Point and built a yearly meeting house on Main Street in High Point. And that meeting house was then transitioned into classrooms and a boys' dormitory and renamed King Hall after Francis King, and immediately burned down. As did the second King Hall. And the third King Hall was a science building, was so woefully inadequate they had to build a new science building. So poor Francis King, who saves the Southern Quaker community, sees Guilford College emerge out of the ashes of Civil War. All of that he contributed, all he gets is a building that burns down consistently and is not adequate for its original purposes, and the shortest street in Greensboro that goes between a defunct brewery and a grocery store. So anyway, but Francis was a great guy. Yeah. Yeah.
To add a little bit more to his history, I know that he came with the Baltimore Association to Snow Camp, where Cane Creek Friends meeting was, and he helped to get Southern Quakers back on their feet, as you were mentioned, but helped the camp people in the Cane Creek community in Snow Camp to establish once again a Sylvan Academy, which in 1910 became a public school, Sylvan High School, that I attended for my first 10 years until we consolidated into Southern Alamance. But Sylvan Elementary is still in existence and being somewhat funded by the Allen Hammer Board of Quakers who moved to Indiana and made a great fortune
Yeah.
off of their farmland
Yeah.
there, and then they continue to support Sylvan Elementary School that's still in existence. So Francis King has a heritage there.
Well, a couple really quick things before we transition to Woodyside. John and Mary Woody were matrons of King Hall, overseeing the boys there, and when it caught fire, they ushered the boys out, saving all their lives. And as Mary is ushering folk out and making sure everyone's safe, she loses her wedding ring in the fire, and no one's ever found it. So if any of you have a really good metal detectors, there's over there somewhere between Duke Memorial Hall and the library is Mary Woody's wedding ring. So, and the other thing is, some of you are probably aware of the whole infant formula issue. The first flights of Operation Infant Formula landed where? Any of you know? Indianapolis. At the Indianapolis airport, built on that Quaker farmland as Quakers left South Carolina and North Carolina and settled in Marion County. The Millses, the Mendenhalls, the Binfords bought all that land, and as the airport expanded, they had to pick up the Lick Branch Cemetery and move it over to Fairfield Friends, and bought the Mills Dairy Farm, and they moved up to Crawfordsville. But all that land where all that infant formula landed used to be a dairy farm. So it's kind of poetic, All righty, well, thank you very much. Now, to get to Woodyside, again, turn right on the New Garden Road, cross over Friendly, cross over West Market, pass where Hedgecock used to be, and those two houses used to be, but just past the railroad tracks, the first right you can take will be Hibbler. So it's about quarter mile or so past the railroad tracks. So head there to Hibbler, turn right onto Hibbler, there'll be a curve, and then park in the Reynolds Chapel Missionary Baptist parking lot.
Oh, he's on this side.
Yeah. I'll get out here on the steeple. How many of you knew this was here? It's interesting as people assemble how many African American communities are on this side of Greensboro that people aren't really aware of. There's Warnersville, of course, established by Yardley Warner as part of the Freedmen's Aid work from Philadelphia early meeting after the Civil War. The mayor was Harmon Unthank, and Unthank's an old Quaker name. Now, he was African American, so there's an indication there that the Unthank Quakers, like so many Quakers, used to be enslavers until 1778. Unbeknownst to many people, but this has been publicized recently, the wealthiest and largest slave dealer in American history was John Armfield, who was raised in a Quaker family in Guilford County, who left Friends probably because they wanted to hold on to their property after Quakers went anti-slavery. And he went on to found Franklin and Armfield up in Alexandria, Virginia, the largest slave dealers in America. Made so much money, he endowed and created the University of the South in Sewanee. So I know they've got some history they've got to deal with, like so many colleges. But speaking of endowing and establishing schools, we talked about the Woodies establishing all those Quaker schools and their connection with UNCG, and DeWitt Benbow connected with Bennett and A&T and Greensboro College and Guilford College. Well, the Woodies were also connected with what's now Winston-Salem State University. John Woody was involved in starting Slater Academy, which became Winston-Salem State. So there's that whole history as well. So anyway, welcome to Woodyside, one of several African-American communities on this side of Greensboro. We meet Warnersville. Terracotta is connected with the Borans. The Borans terracotta work and brickwork, and you can still see remnants of that old mill village there off of West Market. At Pomona, there was the Pisgah Church community, African American community, Collins Grove, and here Woodyside that goes back to the late 1800s. Now there's not a lot to see. Much like in our brochure, a lot of significant places have disappeared. I want to point out a couple, and then as we drive to Persimmon Grove, we can drive through a little bit of the community. Where the apartment complex is now is a very significant spot. That was the baseball field. And like so many communities back in the day, they had baseball teams or football teams. Remember I pointed out Georgiana Staley Coble, her brother Augustus Eugene Staley established the Staley cornstarch business up in Decatur, Illinois after he left the South, and had a football team for that mill town called the Decatur Staleys, and he hired George Hallis to coach and play for them in the late 19 teens. And he went on and bought the Decatur Staleys, moved them to Chicago, and became the Chicago Bears. So there, the mills, had teams. Communities had teams, and Woodyside had a baseball team, a really good baseball team. I can't remember the name of it, but I think Theresa may recall it. But blacks, of course, until Jackie Robinson, couldn't get into the major leagues. There were the Negro Leagues, and fortunately their stats are now into major league stats. But these excellent baseball players couldn't go on to the majors, but they produced some really good baseball players. But they also had a role in honing two very famous Greensboro baseball players into the major leagues, the Farrell brothers. The Farrell family had a dairy farm right across 421 West Market from Woodyside. Edgewater Apartments, and right at beyond Edgewater Apartments, past Captain Bill's Seafood Restaurant, is a brick house. That was the old farmhouse of the Farrell family, and they had a dairy farm there. And Quakers, back in the day, you can't dance, you can't play cards, you can't have any fun, especially on Sunday afternoons, you can't work. But what are kids on a farm going to do? They're going to play baseball, because you got a big family, you got pasture fields, you got a corn crib as a backstop, and dry cow patties as bases. And that's how I played back in Indiana. And the Farrell brothers, 7 of them, became very good baseball players. But with only 7, they could just play kind of home run derby. There's a great story in their book about how that played into a time when Wes Farrell was a pitcher and Rick Farrell was a catcher on opposite teams and hit home runs off of each other. But anyway, these folk were really good ball players, and they had a team. So where did the Farrell brothers play a lot? They played over here. This interracial activity that most people are probably unaware of. But this was the 1910s, 1920s. And Rick Farrell went on to Guilford College. Wes Farrell went to the Benbow Academy in its later days. The Benbow Academy became what? Oak Ridge Military Academy. After all those Quakers left for Indiana. And Wes Farrell went to Oak Ridge Military Academy. Didn't go to Guilford. They both went into the pros. Now, again, honing their skills here, playing with this African-American team. When Rick Farrell's playing days were over and he retired, he became an executive with the Detroit Tigers for 45 years. And as an executive of the Detroit Tigers, he was responsible for their drafting. One of the first people he drafted was a catcher out of Woodyside, because he knew how good they were. So there's that connection as well. So that's where the baseball field was. Now the school that you have in your brochure was where that little park is. You see the little gazebo? Yeah. That's where that school was. And again, Waldo Woody gave that plot of land for the building of that school after the Rosenwald School burned down up 421 West Market at Stagecoach, where the cemetery is now. That was where the original Persimmon Grove Church was in 1882. Little log church, then a little proper frame church was built there. Cemetery was donated. And then 1949, a plot of land was purchased off Dolly Madison, and in 1958 the current Persimmon Grove AME Church was dedicated, where we'll be going at 11 o'clock. But you know, for all those years there was this African American community here, and we'll look forward to hearing Theresa talk about the history of that community. One of the people who lived in this community, and I hope that Theresa will talk about this, eventually lived here in Woodyside, was an African American from Danville, Virginia. And during the Civil War, as he was living in Danville, Virginia, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. And he's trying to figure, okay, what do I do? And it's not in effect yet in Virginia, but I've got to figure out, you know, eventually, do I stay here? Do I go north? What do I do? His friend said, go south, the Quakers will take care of you. So he came down here to the New Garden community, a James Staples, connected to those Staples, the Staples family singers, Mabel Staples, I mean, distant relations. But James Staples comes down here, eventually lives in the Woodyside community, and becomes the keeper of the boiler room at Guilford College. Now the hut, then the hut, my office for 25 years. The boilers burned up in 1919. They built a new boiler room. That became kind of a little student hangout. It became known as the hut, and more recently is a coffee shop, above whose fireplace is what? A mantle made from that tree. So all kinds of connections, but be sure to ask Theresa Morton about Meacham, about James Staples. If you don't, I will.
How big was this community? I mean, how many people lived in it?
It's not very big. Okay. And there's one loop road.
I mean, back then what was
back then, Persimmon Grove Church was up there at Stagecoach.
Okay.
So Raleigh's Crossroads is down there. So it's spread out. Yeah, spread out. Good. And again, not a lot to see. I'd asked if anyone from the church would be able to meet with us, and they weren't. But what we'll do, yeah.
The pastor did not know we were going to be here, but she's around.
She just got
Oh,
Jeremy,
okay.
let me see if
Sure.
Max, are you also going to talk about Pomona, the Bourne Brick community? Pomona?
Not a lot. There were connections.
Oh, okay.
Doug Gilmer, grew up in the terracotta community. Let me go over.
Okay.
What we're going to do, hop in your cars, and we're going to just take a loop through Woodyside, and then we'll come back. After we take a loop, we'll then go out where there's a stoplight on West Market, hang a right, and go to Dolly Madison, 403 Dolly Madison, Persimmon Grove Church. So the first thing to see, we're going to head that way, and right where the road turns, you'll note a cement platform on the right. That's where the little grocery store juke joint was, where they had their entertainment on weekends. And then we'll just make the loop and then head back out again on the West Market, hang a right, and then head down to Dolly Madison, just probably cross over New Garden College Road to Dolly Madison, hang a left, 403 Dolly Madison. All righty?